Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever it may be that you're watching this from. This video is going to be a short one, but I just want to circle back to the topic of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. There's been a lot of chatter on social media over the last few days about the possibility of a false flag event being caused at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So a false flag event being an event which is staged by, let's say, that person intending to be the victim stages an event to make it appear as though they have been attacked, when in fact they had caused the attack themselves. The Jesse Smollett incident would be something I guess you can consider as a false flag attack. What's happening, or what's being talked about in Zaporozhye, is that the nuclear power plant has been controlled by the Russians since last year. During the period of time that they have controlled the plant, there have been numerous reports of shelling of the nuclear power plant. Now, those reports have alleged that it's been Ukrainian forces shelling the Russian positions at the nuclear power plant. The nuclear power plant has been shut down to some extent. There's about 6 reactors there. I've read that a large number of them have been put down into a shutdown mode, so they're not actively hot and operating at this stage. And while there may be one that's still operating there, in general they've been put into a sort of a dormant state. So they still contain nuclear or radioactive material, and they still have a reliance upon water for some level of cooling. So the impact of the draining of the Novokakhovka reservoir, now, I don't think that has caused an impact yet. I think that water is still being made available to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So I don't think that is a concern. But the Ukrainian media has been raising the spectre of the Russians mining the plant and planning to damage or destroy the plant. Now, I've spoken about this before, and in my opinion, I struggle to see any reason that the Russians would damage the plant. Like right now, they control the plant. It's on the left side or the eastern side of the Dnieper River. They're holding that. They're holding that ground around that plant. For them to damage it would mean they would have to evacuate and give up that position, and effectively there would become an area of the front line which they could no longer control. They would have to step back from. The Russians are likely wanting to use the power from the plant that is generated from the plant in the future. Their expectation will be that they will move perhaps further west across Ukraine with time, and that by maintaining the nuclear power plant in operational order, they would be able to then leverage the power generated from it for the rebuilding exercise, as has been shown in Mariupol. There's some footage that's come out of Mariupol, which suffered heavily last year, was damaged heavily, where there are brand new apartment blocks having been built there by the Russians who are controlling the area now. So, to me, it makes sense that the Russians would like to, at all costs, maintain this in an operational state. And be able to use the power from it. I also think that there's very little likelihood that they would want to damage this plant, given the impacts that would occur if there were to be radiation leakage. One, if there's airborne radiation leakage, which could occur, let me just come back to that. One thing to say here is that the Zaporozhye nuclear plant isn't like Chernobyl, where it is a hot operating nuclear reactor, and where there is at least as I understand it, where there is the possibility of there being a steam burst, as happened at Chernobyl, where the cooling fluid becomes overheated. That cooling fluid over time becomes radioactive itself, and so a steam cloud of radioactive water vapor is released. That, I don't believe, is a possibility here, the Zaporozhye, because of the way that the reactors have been put into a dormant phase. However, the possibility for a breach of the containment is possible. There are many ways that it could happen. There could be an intentional missile strike upon the reactors. Now, the reactors are cased in concrete to make them to contain radiation and to provide security against damage to the reactors. Certainly, that would be capable of providing protection against just sort of regular shelling from a distance, I would imagine, unless you had a lot of shells landing in one point repeatedly. However, when you perhaps consider maybe a strike from something like a Storm Shadow or an Iskander missile, we saw the Russian Iskander missile in video footage just this week do significant damage to the bridge south of the Zaporozhye power plant down in Kherson. So that's a possibility. Now, again, that wouldn't necessarily cause a steam release, but a missile strike may cause leaking of radioactive water. Remember that the nuclear power plant is right on the river. So if there were some sort of an uncontained leak of the cooling system, this would most likely leak directly into the Dnieper River, which would become a major ecological catastrophe if there was to be some level or even some contained or a sustained level of release of nuclear material into the river. I mean, that river flows down past Kherson, through Ukraine and down to Odessa, and then into the Black Sea, and then given prevailing currents, and I guess the amount that was released, it could carry around to Romania and possibly across then even to Turkey. And again, I'm unaware of the natural currents flowing through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, but may eventually even interrupt shipping through those areas, perhaps. Who knows? So regardless of whether there would be a large explosion or not, there's the real risk of some sort of a leak of nuclear nuclear material. So what's sort of leading to this, and why I'm talking about this, is there've been a number of Ukrainian Telegram channels, and some of them have been indicating information suggesting that servicemen from the 124th and the 126th Brigades, as well as another 406 Independent Artillery Brigade, have conducted radiochemical and biological protection exercises in the territory on the right bank of the Kherson region, which is just opposite where the nuclear power plant is, on the left bank or the eastern side. Now, this may just be regular training that they're doing because they're operating near a nuclear power plant and something could happen. However, in the last week or so, there's been a swarm of information relating to possible nuclear material breaches. Poland has been releasing flyers to the general public and talking about what the public should do if there is a nuclear event. There has been talk from both Ukrainian and Russian Telegram channels that they believe that something may be occurring within the next week, and this may be a prelude to the NATO summit in Vilnius on the 11th and 12th of July. There has been a lot of talk about Zelensky needing to find a way to convince NATO to either allow Ukraine to join NATO and thus be given security guarantees from NATO, or, as is being talked about, to be able to convince some of the NATO states, a coalition of the willing, if you will, who would be willing to provide security guarantees and then insert their forces into Ukraine to fight on behalf of Ukraine. This, of course, leads to its own issues where that may just be the foot in the door to then goad Russia into striking back. If, for example, Poland or Romania inserted their troops under some security guarantee, then Russia might be inclined to then attack Polish or Romanian airfields, which could then launch an Article 5 situation. So, interesting. So while Zelensky and the Ukrainians have been claiming that the Russians are preparing to damage or make an attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, remembering that the Russians currently hold it and have held it for months. So while the Ukrainian media is suggesting that, the Americans, the US has stated that they've not seen any signs that Russia intends to attack the plant. It was announced on Monday at a briefing where the communications manager for the White House, John Kirby, he stated that they've not seen any signs that this threat of undermining the nuclear power plant by Russian forces is imminent, but they're watching it very closely. Kirby also said that the US have the ability to monitor the radiation situation near the plant. He didn't indicate how, and he didn't indicate what the current situation is as a baseline. But he did say that the United States is not currently recording an increase in radiation levels in the area of Zaporozhye. So Simplicius the Thinker, who, if you are not aware of Simplicius, he posts on Substack some really well thought out and insightful commentaries about the Ukraine conflict. Check out Simplicius. So he says that he always sort of postulates that this could be one of two things. This could be the Americans trying to diffuse or perhaps distance themselves from a false flag attack if Ukraine were to either cause an attack or do something so that they could perhaps suggest that the Russians had caused the attack. This may be the Americans getting in early and distancing themselves from that. Or, Simplicius suggests, this might be a way of the US signaling to the Ukrainians that, as he says, we don't have your back, don't do this. Difficult to know what it might be. He goes further on to suggest that perhaps this is actually an attempt by Zelensky to gain leverage, to effectively blackmail the US and NATO by putting them in a position where he might say, if we don't gain your security guarantees at the Vilnius summit, then we will force this false flag event on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Now, how that might look, I don't know. You know, they might shell the plant, suggest that the Russians have started to damage the plant, and hope that that's enough to trigger NATO and Western outrage and get some security guarantee for them. Or they may actually make an attack on the plant so that a radiation level is elevated, and again suggest that the Russians have done this. Either way, if it does get to that point, this is very, very bad. Either if the Ukrainians are thinking of getting to the point where they would blackmail the Russians and NATO to get involved with such an activity, then we could be very close to World War III if NATO does pay the ransom effectively and says, okay, we'll join, we'll find a way and we'll get in and join. Because now we have Russia fighting all of NATO in an open war against Russia. Or if the US and NATO call Zelensky's bluff and say, we don't think you'll do it, and they do use, for example, a missile strike on the plant, there is some sort of a breach, then Ukraine's now in a position where part of Ukraine may become uninhabitable and unusable, and the natural major waterway, the Dnieper River, running through Ukraine, the southern part of it may become unusable if it were to become radioactive. Now, again, I've got to stress it's the configuration of the plant as it is now isn't one that we should expect to see a large explosion like Chernobyl. That was for different reasons. But nevertheless, a missile strike to a reactor which breached the concrete casing, a second missile strike which then caused a large explosion, would send out into the air a large amount of radioactive material. And again, that only has to settle, the bulk of it, so the heavy debris settle locally around the waterways and the riverways to then cause who knows what level of damage to the river. If some of it then becomes airborne, who knows, depends on which way the wind's blowing that period of time, which way it might go. But there are many towns and settlements around this area who would be impacted. Another interesting point was that Simplicus raised was that the CIA director was recently on a secret trip to Ukraine and was there to hear about the plans for the war's endgame. So, interesting to understand what the Ukrainians are suggesting to the CIA director of what their endgame plans might be, and if those plans are expected to occur soon. One other thing, though, which is also perhaps reassuring, is that the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, who have inspectors on site, have not reported any Russian mining of the plant. Their statement is that the IAEA experts have not yet found any visible signs of mines or other explosives currently installed at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. But they still need additional access to conduct further such inspections at the facility. According to him, the agency's experts over the past week also did not record any shelling or explosions in the area of the power plant. So this is good, but the whole situation itself is hopefully just puffery and propaganda and trying to make the Russians look bad. But the concern is, if you look at the reasons for who might gain something out of this, I struggle to see how the Russians would gain out of doing this themselves, particularly in a point of time where we've got the Zaporozhye, the chief, the head of the Russian armed forces, of the Ukrainian armed forces, indicating in a Washington Post interview that he's running short on shells, that he doesn't have the artillery that he needs, that they're suffering, that they don't have air support. Based on that, the Russians appear to be in a relatively solid position. They've defended the last month the Ukrainian offensive and have given away very little ground. There's been very little advances made by the Ukrainians of any significant nature. So, if you were to be looking for someone who may be becoming desperate or is desperate to secure additional support, then that seems to more likely to be the Ukrainians. And that's not to say that they would actually damage the plant, but even just the talk of this at this stage just gives an indication of how escalated things are and really just how dangerous a situation we are in, because if there is nuclear material released because of damage to the plant, or even the strong belief that that has happened, then we get to the situation where the discussion of tactical nukes now is something that comes onto the table, because we're already talking about nuclear. People will be saying, well, look, that area, if it's needed be, it's already perhaps been damaged by the nuclear radiation from the plant attack, so we could use nukes in that area. It just gets us a step closer to a to a nuclear dispute, which no one in their right mind wants, because the outcome for this is just terrible for Ukraine. If this does happen, if the plant is damaged, that river being taken out, the ability for it to possibly flow down to Odessa and the ports down there will just have a long-term impact on Ukraine's ability to export material and recover from the war. Okay, that's that. Hopefully this comes to nothing and this video was a waste of time, but there's increased chatter. So I just wanted to get something out there about this. If you've liked this or if you're enjoying these videos, please subscribe, share, like. I'll talk to you soon.